Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. Hope you all are doing well. We're moving on to Chapter 10. We still have a few more chapters here in Unit 2, but should have quizzes 7 and 8 up, and then I'm going to try to put up 9 today, so think in on that. Get those in for the due date. We do have only a few people still have actually signed up for the crop selection for the crop project, so please do that as soon as possible. I'm just going to say we're going to make a participation grade out of it. So if you don't sign up for your crop by next Monday, then you're going to lose points for not participating there. We have to get that in so we can move along and get that project underway as we're approaching the midterm here. So let's get on with Chapter 10. We're going to try to cover the whole thing today of Chapter 10. A lot of it we actually already touched on, started to cover, so some of it will be review. We'll get into that, and then we'll be kind of talking soon about your crop projects. And let me see if I can share my screen here. Having technical difficulties today. Sorry, guys. Here we go. All right. You guys see that?
Yep.
All right, here we go. So we're talking about naming, classifying, origin, improvement of crops, as well as germplasm diversity and preservation. Kind of a lot of topics to cover in a short amount of time, but again, a lot of it's review. So first off, this is kind of an interesting thing that they say in the book. Remember, it is a little outdated. They say there are over 500,000 different kinds of plants. Well, I would say there's actually quite a bit more than that. We have over 400,000 species of plants that they believe to be on the planet. We have over 300,000 that are named. So what do they mean by 500,000 different kinds of plants? They're talking about subspecies, varieties, cultivars, which really, I mean, if we add all that together, there's probably over 1 million, I would say. So I just wanted to point that little error out. Of course, in order to know what a plant's uses are and how to be able to identify it and share that information with other people, we've got to name them, right? So often we just use the common name, but we have to get beyond just using the common name for many reasons that we'll kind of outline today. And there's so many different systems in which we try to classify plants based on all these different realms of classification. So we got to be able to identify and name crops. And one way that we classify different crops is how they grow in climates. So as we mentioned before, we have our different hardiness zones. And so some plants are classified by their ability to grow in those different zones. Again, that is based on the lowest low temperature, and I should say the average lowest low temperature, because that is kind of all over the place. Usually for each zone, it's around 10 degrees. It kind of fluctuates a little bit. But the lower the zone, the colder it gets. The higher the zone, the warmer it is. The lowest lows in the winter, that is. So, of course, when we're talking about annual crops, they have specific climatic requirements. We talk about winter or summer annuals, and we base our planting time on that. Whether in winter annuals, we plant them in the fall, and then they bloom early the following spring. Summer annuals are planted in the spring and bloom through the summer and fall. And then we talk about the crops growing in seasons too. So throughout the year, as well as just kind of different temperature ranges. So we got warm season plants, and we usually say 65 to 80 degrees is kind of the optimum average temperature for those crops. Of course, they can withstand much higher, and they don't grow very well below 65, although they still put on some growth. And of course, a cold spell will kill them. So we have frost. It actually freezes the cells of the plants, causes the cytoplasm, everything that was held in that cell wall, to leak out, basically, and then slowly die, or quickly die in some cases. Cool season crops. And I think the average temperatures are a little bit off here because ideally, kind of their optimum production temperatures, depending on the plant, would be between 60 and 65. But again, they grow over a wide range. I mean, we can grow broccoli and cabbage in the heat of summer, especially particular varieties. So there's a lot of overlap, but generally we refer to warm season and cool season crops. And in that way, we can really extend our kind of seasonal production, our crop production throughout the year. I want to say the main limiting factor on crop production other than temperature is light. So as soon as we start, really here soon, we're not going to get any growth of cool season crops. And that's just due to low light conditions at our latitude. We can also look at cultivated varieties and classify them by which seasons they are likely to flower and fruit, and whether that's early in the season, middle of the season, or late maturing. Usually we look at a figure that many seed companies share with us, and that is date to maturity. And that's different for every crop variety. When we look at vegetables, we classify them according to their edible parts. For ornamentals, we look at them based on their use, usually their aesthetic value when they bloom, or in some cases when the leaves are the most showy. For indoor plants, house plants, they're classified according more to their foliage, their flowers, their growth habits, often mostly by the foliage though. Because these are tropical plants that we've brought indoors. Temperate plants really don't function as houseplants. We could keep them indoors for a little while, but they have to go through things like a cool season in the winter and they have to senesce, die back to the ground. Classification really depends on your perspective. So if you're interested in forestry, you would classify forest crops, often trees, mostly into hardwoods and softwoods. And generally, when we think of the difference in hardwoods and softwoods, it's often associated with whether they're deciduous or evergreen. So most hardwoods are deciduous trees, most evergreens are softwoods. And of course, they're also classified by the hardiness zone too. So we have multiple classification systems kind of going on at the same time, which can get a little confusing. And here's just some picture of some large trees that are actually softwoods. In the Sierra Nevada of California there, we have coast redwoods, and we have the Jeffrey pine. The Jeffrey pine has the largest cone of any pine tree. Pretty cool. So I know we already talked about this a little bit in the common and botanical names. And of course, generally in conversation, we just use the common name, but that's really only useful when both people know exactly what plant they're talking about. Generally in different communities, we have different names for different plants. So here we look at jasmine as an example. And jasmine is just a descriptive common name word that really could describe multiple species of plants, as we see here on the right. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different species of plants that are all called some type of jasmine, even though they're not closely related at all. So common names really have a lot of limitations, and there are often too many of them. If we think about areas, and it's different in the United States, of course, but think about Europe, for instance, where they have, similar plants growing along huge area of that same continent. So we can have different languages describing the same plant. When we look at the scientific or botanical name, though, it's all the same. So let's talk about how we got into that. First, we have the philosopher Theophrastus, and also kind of one of the first naturalists classifying plants by their texture or form. And then we have Carl von Linné, aka Linnaeus, who lived in the 1700s, who actually devised the system of categorizing plants as well as all living organisms that we still use today, leading to our modern taxonomy, which is based on grouping things together based on their physical characteristics. And we call that a taxa, that's plural, or taxon for the singular. So first taxon, we talk about domain, and domain is based on the cellular level. Prokaryotes being unicellular and having no subcellular units, and eukaryotes having multiple cellular units and multiple cells. So most living things, of course, are eukaryotes, and we look at basically the different kingdoms. And in agriculture, we look at really all of these kingdoms in some respect: fungi, protista, plantae, and animalia. Of course, in this class, we focus on the plant kingdom, which we then further divide on the kind of phylum level into first the bryophytes, which are all very small plants growing low to the ground, often mosses and liverworts. And then an evolutionary step up, the vascular plants. And then we divide those vascular plants whether they have seeds or not. So if we look at seedless plants, they reproduce by spores, and those include things like club mosses and ferns. All the seeded phyta, and again, this is kind of evolutionary in a way. We have the cycadophyta, ginkgophyta, the coniferophyta, which is our conifers, and then the anthophyta or magnoliophyta, which are angiosperms, our flowering plants. And the vast majority of our crops are in that angiosperm category, the flowering plants, but not all of them. Again, it depends on what your perspective is. You could definitely use ginkgo or conifers as agricultural production, especially when we're looking at forestry or medicinal products. But angiosperms tend to be the largest. And we mentioned this before, but then it kind of goes further down, dividing these in descending rank. First, class. Big thing on class is monocot or dicot, referring to the number of cotyledons, the seed leaves that the plants have, and then the whole plant structure, really. And we look at order, family, genus, and finally species. When we're looking at plant identification, generally the highest taxon we use is family. That's really what we try to focus on. And that day that we talked about patterns in plant families, it's really what we're referring to there. And that really the families are grouped together by their sexually reproductive parts, their flowers and fruits, and to a lesser extent sometimes leaves as well. But generally, it's really fascinating because we look today at grouping them together by their phylogeny, their genetics, and they've started to really look at the genetics of all of our crop plants, and most of the genomes have actually been mapped. And they actually prove that Linnaeus was correct in many cases in grouping them together by their flowers and fruits. Sometimes he was wrong, though. So, and the language that we use for all of this nomenclature is Latin. And some of the reasons why we use Latin is because, one, it's a dead language. No one speaks it anymore, so that the words and their meanings are not likely to change like they would in English or other languages. So let's talk about plant ID and nomenclature. And first, names that kind of refer to leaves in the scientific name. We'll see things like folius or phylon as suffixes. And then we might add a prefix like macro or micro, referring to the size of the leaf. macrophylla, a large leaf, microphylla being a small leaf. Or in some cases, it might have the genus of the plant, like Ilex ilicifolius is the holly leaf. And we could have a different plant that has a holly-type leaf. We might put ilicifolius as the species. And here they talk about the southern magnolia, Magnolia grandiflora, because it has a large flower. So the Latin is also very descriptive. It's not always descriptive, though. In some cases, it's just referring to or honoring a botanist's name. But other things they look at is often things like the shapes of the growing plants and the different forms they take, whether they're tall, like alta, or tree-like, arboreous. Compactus would be dense. You might have dwarf or creeping or climbing or weeping, all kinds of different Latin words that describe these plants. Also, flower foliage color, or sometimes even bark color we see as well. And so knowing those colors can help you to identify plants sometimes. Albus or alba being white, as well as leuco, argentus being silver, aureus being gold, rubra, etc. being red, flavus or luteus being yellow. So also where a plant originates, australis being southern, borealis being northern. So like think about the northern and southern lights, the aurora australis and borealis. Whether it grow, what type of habitat it grows in some cases, or maybe from a particular area like canadensis from Canada or chinensis from China, chilensis from Chile, virginicus from Virginia, japonica from Japan. So we use the binomial nomenclature, and really what we're referring to here is the genus and the species. And I like to think of it it's kind of backwards in a way. The genus, I like to think of sort of the last name, your family name, right? Whereas the species is kind of more like your first name. And often the species is the specific epithet and tends to be a little bit more descriptive. So also today there are, and actually for a long time, there have been these basically codes for naming plants. And there are actually kind of governing bodies of botanists that look at these different codes and actually give the proper names of them. And we have different bodies for different, whether it's a wild plant or a cultivated plant. So some basic rules of the nomenclature. Just know that when we're using the genus name, it always is capitalized on the first letter, the initial letters capitalized. It's either underlined if handwritten, or if it's typed, it's italicized. The species is, and ignore what they say here, it's always lowercase, even if it is a person's name. Also, this next one I don't really use very often, but you'll see it in print. They generally give credit to the person that first named the plant, and so they'll put a letter at the end. So for instance, let's just say red maple, Acer rubrum, they would put an L at the end to give credit to Linnaeus, who first described that plant. But we see, if we just use the binomial name, I think that's fine. You don't have to remember or memorize who named what plants. We also have several divisions that are kind of below the genus, or in some cases below the species as well, or different abbreviations to refer to plants. Maybe we don't know what a species is. If we don't know a singular species, then we put SP period. If there are multiple species that we don't know that are in the same genus, we would put SPP. And often when we write or continually write about one genus, we tend to abbreviate the genus name and just put the first letter, period, and then the species, especially in scientific papers. So below the species level, we have things like botanical or natural variety, cultivated variety, and in some cases we even have groups. So the natural or botanical variety is often referring to, you'll see the letters VAR, period, VAR. It's usually referring to a particular geographic area that the plant came from. So boxwood, Buxus microphylla, var japonica is a specific type of that species that only grows in Japan. When we look at cultivated varieties, and this is a little outdated too, they abbreviate the word cultivar with CV or CVS, but more often today we just put it in single quotation marks. Of course, cultivated variety is a little bit different than a natural variety because it is often, or really always, only unique in cultivation. If it's unique in nature, then it's a variety, but then we might cultivate that variety, and then it's often only found in cultivation. So, cultivated names are always capitalized, every single word in the cultivated variety, but are never underlined or italicized. So family, of course, closely related genera. And just as an example, here's the Solanaceae. Again, they're grouping these together by their reproductive parts. So you can see that the potato and tomato flower are extremely similar, as well as the pepper flower. I mean, they're almost identical if you look at the makeup of the flower. They've got kind of a star-shaped flower that has these 5 different petals that are fused into one corolla. So that's why we group them together. That's Solanaceae, the nightshade family. We add these endings to the family name, AC or ACA. Really, I don't care how you guys pronounce it. No one really speaks Latin anymore, so pronounce it how you want to and what makes you remember how to spell it. They've recently kind of changed family names. I say recently, but it's been a while now. It's been over 100 years, but they used to refer to like Asteraceae as Compositae. And I think it's sometimes good to know these old names as well, because sometimes the old names are somewhat descriptive. Like for the Fabaceae, the legumes, they used to call them Leguminosae. So you can actually kind of learn some things from the old family names. And they have this backwards too, the new name versus the old name. And botanists they're different. They're kind of a fussy bunch because they use these interchangeably often. So knowing that is important as well. For a second, we'll talk about one way to identify plants, and that is by using a key. And there are lots of different keys out there. I'm looking around to see if I have one in the room here. I don't think I do, but for instance, there's a key to the flora of Virginia. That's every plant that grows wild in Virginia, and it's broken down into this kind of choose your own adventure dichotomy, branching where you have 2 choices basically. Big thing with using a key is that you have to know a lot of botanical vocabulary in order to really be able to progress throughout the key. So they'll give you a pair of numbers, and then whichever one fits the description of the plant will take you to another set of 2 numbers. So you're basically narrowing down the choices by going through them, looking how it best fits these particular characteristics. It's important to recognize, though, that can vary in different environments, the difference in genotype and phenotype. So it's not necessarily easy. It is the most surefire way to get to the species level if you're looking at a regional plant key. Of course, when we're looking at plant keys, we have to be familiar with what parts of the plant are available. You might not be able to identify a plant using a key at a particular time. because it didn't have its flowers or it didn't have its fruit. They use all these different botanical characteristics to group species together. But here's just an example of a simplified key, and it's actually goes on further in your book on pages 203 to 204. And this is just for just the kind of seed-bearing plants. It's really general to kind of try to get you to the family, in some cases the genus level too. So it might be a good idea to kind of practice using a key or kind of looking through a different key to try to identify plants. Some of them, of course, are very difficult to classify because of their unique features that really don't allow them to fit in other categories. For instance, on the left there, the cycad, it is the flower that makes it a cycad instead of a palm. If you were just to look at the leaves, you would probably call it a palm. And in many cases, they actually do. The common name is palm, even though technically, botanically speaking, it's not. In the case here on the right, the fruits of Taxus baccata are unique because this is actually a cone-bearing plant. It's in the Coniferophyta, but it actually has a fleshy fruit, which really it was kind of one of those evolutionary features that kind of led to the angiosperms, but it doesn't really look like a cone, does it? Junipers, kind of similar. They have these blue cones that look more like fruits. And that's just kind of a little bit of evolutionary crossover there. Couple of features here, and they say this is hard to classify on cotton because it has a really, kind of a different form of flower than many other plants, but really they just group all those plants together into that hibiscus family. Slightly different than other plants because of when the flower opens. So, and then another one here with a strawberry flower because it's got this really unique fruit that is different than anything else in that same family. So it's a little bit more difficult to classify, although we know what that plant is. It's very familiar in our society, but still difficult to classify because it's unique botanical features. As we talked about, most crop plants, all crop plants, came from primitive ancestors. Started just by a selection of food plants, but then later on we started to cultivate more ornamentals, looking at the aesthetics and other uses of plants too. Of course, talk for a second about Vavilov, who I mentioned from the very beginning, who wrote about the origins of plants and these independent centers of where they originated. And we've kind of already looked at this, so I'm just going to look back here at the plant map here that he developed of the domestication of plants. And in the book, it's interesting because it says that that we had no major crops that were indigenous that had wild relatives in North America. And yet here on this image that they put in there, it goes to show you that, yeah, we did. We have plums, grapes, blueberries, cranberries, pecans, sunflowers, and tepary beans all came from North America. So some conflicting information there, but I would like you guys to remember where our major crops came from. Of course, some plants we are not cultivated by fruit and seed, as we discussed. Some can really only be cultivated through vegetative methods. And some of these ancient examples of these early plants include grapes, figs, olives, mulberries, pomegranates, and quince. And we know that because, ancient peoples actually depicted this. There's actually a fresco in a tomb in Egypt that really depicts the cultivation of grapes and how they, in Egypt, actually made them into wine. So we look at both. we kind of think of vegetative propagation as an advancement. It's in agriculture, but it's been happening for a really long time as well. We also already talked about this very early on, but the domestication of seed plants and the beginnings of agriculture really began with the purposeful harvesting of wild grass seeds due to the observance of a mutation of shattering and non-shattering types. Remember, shattering is the natural shedding of the seed. Those that didn't shatter allowed them to be able to harvest those seeds and replant them rather than just try to gather them from the ground. Our plant agriculture kind of really begins with that whole concept of planting these harvested seeds closely together in a cultivated plot that tries to discourage things like competing weeds. And as we continue to save those seeds from those plants, we are really kind of breeding them and selecting them for stronger, more vigorous plants. There are many desirable characteristics that have arisen from selection that really allows agriculture to occur, such as the loss of seed dormancy, for instance. Increased flower numbers and larger flowers, larger fruits, trends towards determinate versus indeterminate growth that makes them easier to harvest. There's all kinds of different characteristics that we select for in different crops. It's fascinating that in some cases we have selected and improved them so much, hybridized them so much, that now these modern cultivated varieties look nothing like their wild ancestors. And in some cases, the wild ancestors don't even exist anymore in nature. In some cases, they depend on us to replant them in order for them to be able to grow. Zea maize corn is an excellent example. You might, every once in a while, see a random volunteer corn pop up, but it's fairly unlikely because of the husk that surrounds it. It preserves that plant for us, the crop, the yield, the fruit of that plant, but it makes it to where it can't shed its seed on its own. We have to remove the husk and actually de-hull it, get the kernels off of the cob, and then replant. Let's talk just for a second about some of these different grain crops and how they evolved. First, wheat, which is now the most widely cultivated plant in the world and is the chief cereal grain used for making bread, which evolved from a wheat-like grass in the Fertile Crescent. And probably we observed mutations, and then maybe unintentionally, maybe intentionally, cause some hybridization. We've developed to this date all kinds of different forms of wheat, which increases yield and decreases negative things about plants, such as lodging, where the plant would fall over because of the heavy seed head at the top. We're going to look at the two major wheat species, Triticum aestivum, which is used for flour, making breads and pastries, and then Triticum turgidum in the durum group, which is used for pasta. Different characteristics of these different grains, these two different species, that allows them to basically have these different uses. And we can look at that really in any crop. We have different selections for different purposes, different plant parts. In the case of flour versus pasta, it's basically looking at the endosperm and kind of the starches that make it up. Wheat, like many of our different cultivated crops, we have to continually develop new varieties to really be able to contend with different plant diseases. Important to know that wheat plants are self-pollinated, which allows farmers to save their seed for future planting. because cross-pollination is difficult. And botanically, that's because the flowers are perfect. They have both male and female parts together on the same flower head. Corn, ZMAs. Don't worry about the dates on these because most of these are off. We're constantly finding more, evidence that leads to say that these crops were actually began to be domesticated much earlier than we think. Teosinte is the closest wild relative that exists today. It's still out there. Corn is fascinating because it's been spread throughout the world, and now it's a very important crop. It's one of the most important commodified crops in the United States. And this is just kind of three different theories that they have here on the origin and domestication of corn. And really, I think that it's probably all three. It's a little bit of each of these three different theories kind of combined together. And one of them, they're kind of looking at a little bit of genetic admixture from the Zea genus as well as the Tripascum genus. They cross together to help to create modern corn. Of course, that's different than really what we look at as corn today, because almost all of the varieties of corn that are grown commercially are hybrids. And that was not really developed until the 1930s. And really, we look at that as a major contributor to the Green Revolution, along with fertilizers, irrigation, mechanization, really hugely improving production. Today, we're producing if you compare it to the early 1900s, we're producing like 20 times the same amount of crops on the same area of land. Corn, like all other crops, really has specific varieties that are bred for specific reasons. Could be the particular constituents in the plant, the particular nutrients, could be for different uses. Today, we're actually looking at breeding corn for ethanol production. Here's just an image of improvement of corn from, they say a more primitive type to a more hybrid modern type. And as you can see here, the modern type has many more kernels. They're lined up in these rows instead of kind of being more randomly scattered in the more ancient type. However, the primitive type still has valuable traits, and really this illustrates the need to maintain germplasm, or really just, I think of germplasm just as the genetics of the plant, the gene pool. Rice is Oryza sativa, and it is grown in the United States, but it's not a huge crop. But it is in many other parts of the world. It's actually the basic grain for more than half of the world's population, mostly due to it being the main grain in the Asian continent. We have about 25 different species of Oryza, but they believe that the perennial variety is what it was first cultivated from. Let me skip over some of that there. Talk about soybeans, glycine max. Another example of, really due to breeding and the development of more disease-resistant and higher yielding cultivated varieties has caused the production to be greatly increased in the United States, and also in other parts of the world as well. And even though soy originated in Asia as well, they found that the modern cultivated soybean is really well adapted to the Midwestern climate, as well as some southeastern states, which now, even though it's more important of a crop in Asia, we still grow a large portion of the world's soybeans here in the U.S. And that just goes to show that really we produce crops where they are best produced. That might not always be where they originated, though. The sugar beet, as we mentioned before, is fascinating because it's a temperate plant. It's a cool season crop that was really developed because it has the same type of sugar as cane sugar, but cane sugar is very expensive because it can only be grown in tropical areas. So someone began to develop sugar beets, and today that's the main source of sugar in North America. Potato, Solanum tuberosum, is one of the big four crops that feeds the world's population. Came from South America, has been spread again throughout the world. One really important characteristic of potatoes is that per pound planted, it is the highest yielding crop on the planet. We are to this day still developing more potato varieties, and actually today going back to the center of origin in South America to look at these different selections and bring these in to increase the gene pool, increase traits for disease resistance. However, most of our potatoes are genetically clones. We asexually propagate them most of the time. There are some cases where we replant seed, find some seed and replant it, but because they are clones, they have the same genes, and therefore as you continue to grow them after many generations, they begin to kind of decline naturally. So that's why we're kind of going back and getting, new varieties, or old but new to us varieties from South America. Another problem with that asexual propagation is that we are probably unintentionally spreading disease. Now we have certified seed potatoes, even though they're not technically seed, it's still clonal propagation, but we have a very particular way of certifying and growing and inspecting them to make sure that they're virus-free. Tomatoes, Solanum lycopersicon or Lycopersicon esculentum, also came from South America, New World, brought back to Europe, and really for a long period of time were just grown as kind of a botanical curiosity, because many plants, sorry, let me go back here, many plants in that genus and family, the Solanaceae and Solanum genus, are poisonous. So it wasn't until really the 1700s and 1800s that it even began to be eaten. Apple, of course, pretty important crop in the Rosaceae family, Malus domestica, is also often clonally propagated through grafting. And apples are also fascinating because we see the major apple cultivars, things like Macintosh or Red Delicious, Golden Delicious. These things arose from spores, from these little mutations on one branches, and then someone cultivated them and began to graft them onto new varieties. Apples are fascinating because, about 100 years ago, we had over 1,000 different cultivated varieties in the United States. And today, about 15 cultivars account for 90% of the apples produced in the United States. We're kind of seeing that trend reverse, though, in some cases because of a renewed interest in old apple varieties. Pears, Pyrus communis, also an important crop, although not nearly as important as apples. Same family, Rosaceae. They're similar looking trees, similar growth and care characteristics. Peaches and nectarines are in the same species, Prunus persica, and are also in the Rosaceae family, and are often having some interesting new varieties being bred, combinations of peaches and plums even, and nectarines, which are also in the same genus, different species, different hybrids of these varieties. I'm sure you guys have seen things like pluots out there, combination of a plum and an apricot. These wide crosses are occurring more often in breeding programs to just get new fruits out there. Strawberries are a natural, well, an unnatural, but the whole crop is a hybrid, basically. And today's strawberry, interesting because it originated in France, but they took two American Fragaria species and crossed them to get our, modern strawberry. A few things about evolution and how this kind of arises and is used in our plant breeding. The theory of evolution combined with Gregor Mendel's theories of heredity and him being the father of genetics are together used to explain evolution and how we actually use these ideas and concepts in breeding of plants. Of course, our modern breeding programs have really advanced how we're able to grow crops. We talked about that a little bit when we were talking about genetics. So, most of our new vegetable and flower lines are superior in terms of vigor and insect and disease resistance. And it's very important because we have to continually develop new varieties to keep up with that insect and disease resistance. We've also, we mentioned this before as well, we've found ways to induce mutations from things like chemical treatments or even radiation with gamma or X-rays that cause more chromosomes to be produced. We've also done some intergenera hybridization. So in this case, we're looking at wheat and rye. This doesn't occur in nature, couldn't have occurred in nature, but because a human made it happen, we created a brand new grain, triticale, by hybridizing wheat and rye, which the name, the genus name there comes from the triticum and secale names of the genus and kind of combining them to triticale. So a couple of things here real quick. Germplasm, really just think of germplasm as basic units of heredity, and that really, when we're talking about germplasm, we're talking about the preservation of gene pools. And we've been exploring plants throughout the world, moving them around the world. This invention of the Wardian case allowed plants to be brought back from, different parts of the world through ship voyages. Major advancement that, although it's kind of silly and very easy to do, really caused us to be able to preserve crops and germplasm. However, there are consequences too. By moving plants around the world, we've introduced devastating insects and diseases, such as the hemlock woolly adelgid or chestnut blight that were never here before. Last couple things here real quick. Accessions, just wanted to point out that word real quick. That just means it's a gathering event. Someone gathered some germplasm. We call it an accession, and we try to preserve those. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization is responsible for preserving these accessions throughout the world. And there are different USDA germplasm repositories around the country that also preserve these, as well as some international efforts, such as the Seed Vault in Svalbard, Norway. And that's a big reason for preserving these accessions, is because as many as 1 in 10 plant species is now believed to be extinct or endangered, which reduces our ability to adapt. So today, the world's peoples are largely fed by only about 20 crops. And reliance on so few crops could lead to catastrophic famine. That's why we're constantly hybridizing and trying to preserve as many genetics as we can, and why those centers of origin and centers of diversity are so important. And yeah, so that's about it for today. And we went a little bit over, so I will say goodbye to you all. Remember to sign up for your crops, you all. We'll see you on Wednesday.
Okay. Bye, everybody. See the lucky view in a few minutes.